Weddings look magical. Flowing white dresses, joyful tears, and promises of forever. But behind the celebration lies a darker truth. In this video, we're uncovering 6 of the worst wedding deaths ever, and every single one turned the happiest day into an unthinkable nightmare. It was March 17, 2018. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the limestone cliffs of the Great Ocean Road near Port Campbell, where wedding guests gathered at a popular lookout point for what should have been the perfect conclusion to Ethan and Sarah Moore's destination wedding celebration. Ethan Moore, a 29-year-old civil engineer from Melbourne, had spent 3 years designing water treatment facilities across Victoria. Ethan had proposed to Sarah at this exact location 2 years earlier, making it the obvious choice for their wedding photos, despite the inherent dangers of the unfenced clifftop. The Great Ocean Road's limestone cliffs rise over 200 feet above the Southern Ocean, carved by millions of years of wave action that continues to erode the soft rock formations. The lookout points along this stretch remain largely unfenced, relying on visitor common sense and warning signs to prevent accidents. Recent March rains had saturated the clifftop soil, making the loose gravel and limestone fragments particularly unstable near the edges where foot traffic had already compromised the surface integrity. The wedding photographer, Janet Williams, had been recommended by Ethan's mother after shooting several family events over the past decade. Williams had built her reputation on dramatic clifftop shots that showcased the rugged coastline, often positioning couples dangerously close to edges for maximum visual impact. During the engagement shoot 6 months earlier, she had repeatedly pushed Ethan and Sarah to move closer to precipices, dismissing their safety concerns as unnecessary caution that would compromise the artistic vision. That afternoon, Williams had insisted on capturing one final dramatic shot of the newlyweds kissing near the cliff edge. The recent rainfall had left the limestone surface slick with moisture, and several guests had commented on the loose gravel shifting underfoot. Williams positioned the couple just 8 feet from the 220-foot drop, directing them through multiple poses while wedding guests watched nervously from a safer distance. After capturing the kiss, Williams demanded that Ethan step backward for a wider composition that would frame the couple against the ocean backdrop. She continued shooting as Ethan carefully moved toward the edge, his dress shoes struggling for purchase on the wet limestone. The gravel beneath his feet had been loosened by the morning's rain, creating an unstable surface that shifted with each step. As Ethan took his final step backward, the saturated gravel gave way completely. His right heel slipped over the edge, and his center of gravity shifted beyond the point of recovery. Sarah screamed as her new husband disappeared over the cliff face, his body striking 2 rocky ledges during the 220-foot fall. The body tumbled unpredictably, striking protruding limestone ledges, and ultimately landing on the final outcrop head first, causing massive cranial trauma. A guest immediately called emergency services at 4:47 p.m., but the remote location meant rescue teams required 35 minutes to reach the scene. Helicopter recovery took another hour due to dangerous wind conditions along the cliff face. The coroner determined that Ethan died instantly from massive head trauma and complete skull fracture. The force of impact had destroyed his brain tissue entirely, making survival impossible regardless of response time. Williams faced a civil lawsuit from Sarah and lost her photography business within 6 months as word of mouth spread. Sarah never returned to the Great Ocean Road and moved to Queensland to escape the constant reminders of her wedding day tragedy. It was June 14, 2015, in the Loire Valley, France. Morning mist hung low over the vineyard estate as guests gathered for a wedding rehearsal. A restored Citroën waited on a gravel drive, angled slightly uphill. The scene felt controlled, celebratory, and fragile. Nothing appeared immediately dangerous to anyone present. Lucy Bernard was 7 years old, the bride's niece and chosen flower girl. She was shy, soft-spoken, and deliberate in her movements after recently outgrowing a corrective leg brace. Walking carefully had become a habit. Family described her as observant and eager to please, practicing her role repeatedly despite fatigue. She trusted adults implicitly and waited quietly during rehearsals, clutching her basket and watching shoes pass on the uneven stone ground nearby without complaint, ever. The vehicle was a restored 1950s Citroën hired for a staged arrival. Vintage cars lack modern brakes and roll easily on inclines. Lucy understood none of this. She focused on posture and timing. standing near a low stone retaining wall, while adults adjusted plans and photographers repositioned guests. The gravel surface, narrow drive, and crowd proximity increased risk if movement occurred. Children were allowed close for pictures without barriers or supervision present that morning there. During rehearsal, the Citroën stalled on the incline and refused to restart. A groomsman suggested towing it several feet using an old hemp rope found in storage. The suggestion bypassed safer alternatives, including wheel chocks or clearing the area, to avoid delaying photographs. No professional mechanic was consulted, and no one assigned crowd control. Guests, children, and staff remained clustered nearby, still watching closely. The rope was visibly frayed, stiff from age, and never rated for vehicle loads. No one voiced objection, and the decision was treated as temporary and harmless. Lucy waited beside the wall holding her basket as adults positioned the second car downhill. Photographers asked for smiles, and guests leaned forward for better angles. The incline increased backward roll potential. No safety buffer existed at all. As tension was applied, the Citroën shifted slightly. Gravel crunched under tires, and murmurs spread through the group. Lucy turned her head toward the sound, unaware the car's weight was now fully dependent on the rope alone. Children remained stationary, assuming adults controlled the situation. No one instructed Lucy to move or step away. The slope amplified any sudden failure instantly without warning or pause. The rope snapped with a sharp crack, recoiling toward the anchored point. The Citroën began rolling backward due to the incline and loose gravel, striking Lucy in the pelvis. She was critically injured immediately, sustaining severe fractures and massive internal bleeding. Witnesses heard a dull, wet impact as her body collapsed. Her basket fell, petals scattering across the gravel beneath her dress. She lost consciousness quickly, and her breathing became shallow and irregular, though complete cardiac arrest did not occur instantly. Adults rushed forward. Several people pushed the car away, relieving pressure within seconds. Despite rapid intervention, her injuries were life-threatening. Heavy bleeding and pelvic trauma made survival extremely unlikely without advanced hospital care. Panic replaced celebration as guests shouted for help. Someone dialed emergency services within moments. Paramedics arrived minutes later, assessing her injuries and stabilizing her on a stretcher before rapid transport. Lucy remained unconscious and in critical condition. Despite immediate medical attention, she succumbed to internal bleeding and blunt force trauma several minutes after the incident. Investigators later confirmed the sequence: the rope's failure, the vehicle's backward roll, and the lack of safety barriers contributed directly to the fatal outcome. The vineyard immediately banned staged vehicle entrances, following the incident permanently after investigation. Lucy's parents sued the rental company unsuccessfully. Responsibility was ruled personal, not contractual. It was December 11th, 2016, in Munich, Germany. The reception hall of a suburban wedding venue was warm, despite winter outside, with heaters humming overhead. A large ice sculpture stood centered above banquet tables, dripping slowly. Marcus Keith Klein, 54, was the groom's uncle and a former machinist who spent decades maintaining factory presses and conveyor systems. Since retiring, he favored routine and stability, attending family events quietly. At the wedding, he sat near relatives, content listening rather than socializing, unaware his seat placed him directly beneath the sculpture. The centerpiece was a 10-foot block carved with floral patterns, delivered late after freezing delays. To protect it, staff brought it indoors early, suspending it from a reinforced frame. Heating vents remained active for guest comfort, accelerating melt. Drips formed puddles, noticed by servers who assumed this was normal. During speeches, condensation increased. The sculpture emitted a sharp, single crack as internal fractures propagated through the melting ice, a sound partially masked by music. Staff hesitated to interrupt, fearing disruption. No barriers cleared the area, and guests remained seated. Marcus leaned forward slightly to hear better, resting forearms on the table. The heat softened internal fractures forming from uneven melt, increasing stress at the upper joint. Minor ice shards began to loosen, threatening nearby guests, though none were struck yet. The load distribution changed rapidly. Water weakened internal bonds, and gravity pulled downward. Those nearby later recalled the loud snap just before failure. Marcus did not look up. No one instructed him to move. Cameras continued recording speeches as the structure reached its limit, unnoticed until collapse. The upper section instantaneously fractured and fell, dropping straight down. It struck Marcus's head and upper chest with crushing force, forcing his chin violently into his chest. The impact compressed his upper cervical vertebrae and completely collapsed his airway, snapping ice across the table. His body jerked forward, then went limp. Plates shattered, water and ice spraying outward. Nearby guests recoiled, screaming. Marcus made no sound, his chest never rose again. Several guests rushed to him, but the mass pinned his upper body. Someone shouted for help. Another called emergency services immediately. CCTV captured the vertical fall and the stillness afterward. Staff struggled to lift the ice, hands slipping on the pooling meltwater. Marcus's face darkened as oxygen flow ceased. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, finding no pulse and complete cervical spinal cord destruction. Resuscitation was impossible. The airway was collapsed and spinal injury complete. Broken ice fragments and pooled water documented the point of impact. Witnesses gave consistent accounts of the crack, drop, and immediate collapse. The weight and height alone explained the fatal force involved. Minor cuts and bruises were noted among nearby guests from flying ice shards, but none were life-threatening. The post-mortem report described crushed neck structures, including the windpipe and major blood vessels. The spinal cord was severed at the upper neck, instantly stopping breathing and nerve signals. Death was immediate, caused by suffocation and neurological disruption. Afterward, the venue removed the sculpture and suspended events. Large-scale ice installations were permanently banned indoors. Safety policies were revised, requiring weight verification, temperature monitoring, and exclusion zones around heavy decor. The funeral was held quietly, attended by family and co-workers from Marcus's factory. It was August 23, 2014, in Chania, Crete, Greece. The outdoor wedding reception was held on a stone terrace overlooking the sea, warm air moving steadily inland. The setting felt festive and controlled, but the environment was already unstable. Nikos Papadakis, 31, was the groom and a lifelong resident of Crete. He worked as a regional sales coordinator for an agricultural equipment supplier. He valued tradition and family reputation, and the wedding was meant to honor both. Friends described him as trusting and conflict avoidant, preferring harmony over confrontation. Nikos had no background in performance safety. He wore a tailored synthetic wool blend suit, which ignites more easily and can melt onto skin than pure wool, and stood near the center of the terrace for photographs. The space was bordered by stone walls that reflected heat and restricted airflow. The fire performers used alcohol-soaked torches rather than long-burning plant oils, which increases splash risk and rapid ignition, but none of this was communicated to Nikos. The fire dance was arranged as a surprise by friends. Performers rehearsed earlier in calmer conditions, but did not reassess the wind as evening gusts strengthened. No fire extinguishers or medical staff were positioned nearby. Nikos was encouraged to stand close to the dancers for dramatic photos, trusting their experience. As music played, guests crowded inward. The wind shifted unpredictably, pushing flames sideways. Some guests noticed sparks drifting but assumed control remained. Nikos smiled and adjusted his stance, unaware that alcohol-based fuel can splatter and ignite clothing almost instantly upon contact. Then one dancer stumbled on uneven stone. The torch struck the ground, sending burning fuel outward. A sheet of flame splashed across Nikos's chest and lapel, igniting his suit rapidly due to the synthetic blend, melting parts onto his skin while flames raced upward along exposed areas. Witnesses screamed as he flailed, hands patting uselessly at the fire. Guests rushed forward, throwing jackets and tablecloths over him. The fire dimmed but did not immediately extinguish. Nikos inhaled superheated air while screaming, collapsing to his knees. His facial hair singed immediately, and blistering developed on exposed skin across his face, neck, and hands within seconds, consistent with direct flame contact. Smoke poured from his mouth as he coughed violently. Someone called emergency services immediately. Staff dragged him away from the performance area, while others smothered remaining embers. He remained conscious but in severe respiratory distress, gasping blackened mucus streaked with blood. An ambulance arrived within 12 minutes and transported him to the nearest hospital. During transport, his breathing worsened as airway swelling developed. Medical personnel attempted intubation due to severe inhalation injury, but progressive edema narrowed the airway beyond the tube's reach. Oxygen was administered, but his lungs could no longer pass sufficient oxygen into the bloodstream. Hospital staff documented extensive burns to the torso, face, and hands, with thermal injury to the trachea and bronchi. Despite treatment, inflammation progressed overnight. The next day, respiratory failure proved irreversible, and he was declared dead. The post-mortem report detailed that death resulted from respiratory failure due to inhalation injury. Investigators cited failure to reassess wind conditions, absence of fire extinguishers, and lack of medical staff. The performers faced civil liability for negligence. The bride postponed funeral arrangements until after his death was confirmed. She withdrew from public view and canceled the remainder of the wedding events. Months later, she relocated from Crete, declining interviews and legal compensation. It was October 14, 2017, at a lakeside banquet hall in Hangzhou, China. The afternoon wedding reception moved smoothly. At the center of the room stood a tall champagne tower, meant to mark the transition into celebration. It looked stable enough, though several people noticed the table beneath it vibrated slightly when brushed. Ling Yunmin was 26, a hotel service assistant at the venue hosting the wedding. He had worked banquets since finishing vocational school, known for being careful and soft-spoken. He was the bride's cousin and had agreed to help that day to save money, hoping to leave hospitality work within a year for logistics training. Management often relied on him during high-visibility events. His job involved setup and crowd control, not performance pieces. Ling Yun understood basic service safety, but was not trained to intervene once ceremonies began. Staff were instructed to follow directions exactly and avoid disrupting the visual plan. That afternoon, the unusually tall tower of glass was assembled quickly to impress guests and social media viewers. The base table wobbled slightly during setup, but supervisors ordered staff not to adjust it once guests entered. The tower's height, combined with a slightly uneven floor, created a precarious condition. The ceremony schedule was tight, and no one wanted delays or visible corrections. As speeches ended, servers noticed champagne dripping down the lower tiers, pooling on the polished floor. Ling Yun shifted position nearby, watching for spills. He glanced at the base again, considering whether to signal someone, then stayed silent, aware of previous reprimands for interrupting ceremonies. When the bride and groom lifted the bottle, applause swelled. Champagne poured unevenly, and the tower leaned a fraction more. Ling Yun stepped back instinctively as liquid spread underfoot. His dress shoes lost traction on the slick surface. The tower tilted decisively. Ling Yun slipped backward, then pitched forward trying to recover. The structure collapsed in a cascading crash of glass. He fell face first into the debris. A long, jagged shard from one of the middle tiers struck the left side of his neck at the carotid level. Witnesses saw a sudden spray of dark red blood pulsing outward in rhythmic bursts, arcing across the white marble floor. Several guests froze, mistaking it for spilled wine. Ling Yun grasped at his throat, eyes wide, then dropped to his knees. Within seconds, his hands slipped, slick with blood. He collapsed fully, movement slowing rapidly as the bleeding continued unchecked. Someone screamed. A waiter shouted for help. A manager called emergency services immediately. Staff attempted pressure with napkins and tablecloths, but blood soaked through instantly. His skin began turning gray as circulation rapidly failed, a process completing within roughly 1 minute. An ambulance arrived 8 minutes later, but paramedics found no pulse and pronounced him dead at the scene. The post-mortem report stated a major artery in the neck had been severed by glass. Blood loss was extreme and rapid, preventing oxygen from reaching the brain. Death occurred in under 1 minute due to circulatory collapse. The venue dismantled all decorative glass structures pending review. Management received fines, but no criminal charges. Ling Yun's parents accepted compensation to clear outstanding debts. It was December 28, 2013. The humid evening air in Barangay San Miguel, Bulacan, carried the scent of food as wedding guests gathered in the concrete courtyard behind the Reyes family home. Ramon de la Cruz, a 34-year-old tricycle driver, checked his watch. The fireworks display would begin soon, marking the climax of his childhood friend Miguel's wedding celebration. Ramon had known Miguel since elementary school, driving him to construction jobs before Miguel saved enough to open his small sari-sari store. As a tricycle driver navigating Bulacan's congested streets for 12 years, Ramon supported his wife Maria and their 2 young daughters through daily 14-hour shifts. His weathered hands and sun-darkened skin told told the story of countless hours exposed to exhaust fumes and tropical heat, but he maintained his cheerful disposition and was known throughout the neighborhood for his reliability and infectious laugh. The wedding celebration had been planned for months, with Miguel's family investing their savings in an elaborate fireworks display featuring a decorative chain of interconnected firecrackers stretching 100 feet across the courtyard. The display included a few large commercial-grade firecrackers with metal casings in addition to the smaller consumer firecrackers, to create louder explosions and brighter flashes. The setup required precise timing in dry conditions, as moisture could cause uneven ignition patterns that made the display unpredictable and dangerous. Earlier that afternoon, heavy monsoon rains had soaked the courtyard, leaving puddles and dampening the carefully arranged firecracker chain. Miguel's uncle, who had organized similar displays before, expressed concern about the wet conditions but felt pressure to proceed since guests had traveled from distant provinces. The family had spent a lot on the fireworks, and postponement seemed impossible. As evening approached, they decided to proceed despite the moisture, hoping the fuses would dry sufficiently. By 9:30 in the evening, over 60 guests crowded the courtyard as Miguel's cousin began lighting the chain. The ignition began normally, with bright flashes and sharp cracks echoing off the concrete walls, but the uneven moisture caused sections to fire out of sequence, creating gaps in the expected pattern. As Ramon stepped backward to avoid a particularly loud burst, he tripped over a plastic chair and fell directly onto an undetonated section containing one of the larger metal-cased firecrackers, just as it ignited. The explosion tore through his lower legs, causing deep lacerations and puncture wounds, with fragments of metal casing and fuse driven into the tissue. Some small bone fractures occurred, though no fragments reached major arteries. Witnesses watched in horror as his pants shredded, and blood immediately soaked the concrete beneath him. Ramon's screams cut through the celebration as guests rushed to help. The wounds were severe, combining burns, deep cuts, and embedded fragments from the metal-cased firecracker, consistent with injuries from improperly stored commercial-grade devices. His brother-in-law tried to call for an ambulance, but Ramon stopped him, citing the possible expensive medical bill. Ramon remained conscious, limping to the outdoor sink where he washed the wounds with tap water and carelessly poured rubbing alcohol over the lacerations, causing intense pain and further tissue damage, then wrapped everything tightly with gauze. He returned home the next day, changing bandages daily and taking over-the-counter pain medication. 9 days later, Ramon developed severe jaw stiffness, making eating impossible, followed by violent muscle spasms throughout his body and increasing difficulty breathing. Ramon died from tetanus on January 6, 2014. The bacteria had entered through the contaminated wounds, releasing toxins that paralyzed his respiratory muscles despite desperate attempts at treatment. The autopsy report confirmed that Ramon had suffered extensive soft tissue damage and multiple puncture wounds consistent with metal-cased firecracker injuries. The wounds were heavily contaminated, providing a clear entry point for Clostridium tetani bacteria. No pre-existing conditions contributed to his death. The pathologist noted generalized muscle rigidity, opisthotonos, and respiratory paralysis characteristic of fatal tetanus. Miguel and his new wife postponed their honeymoon indefinitely, overwhelmed by guilt that their celebration had cost Ramon's life. Thanks for watching. If you liked these stories, click here.